Okay, so welcome everybody. We're starting to think about in the book of Genesis, the second one of the three patriarchs, Isaac, Yitzchak, and we don't get a lot of information about Isaac. Of all the patriarchs in the Torah, Isaac we get the least about. We have just very few episodes. And if you want to compare him to his father Abraham, so Abraham, there's three portions in the Torah, certainly two full ones, and some of the third. So I would say three portions of the Torah that discuss Abraham and Isaac, and then talk about if you want to talk about Jacob, Jacob has almost six if you count his children, the episodes of his children. So Jacob is also many portions in the Torah about Jacob. Isaac, we know the least about, and that's this week's parsha. And it starts talking about Isaac, and right away it talks about his descendants, his children, because Isaac has twins, and a lot of the stories of Isaac we really get to as through the lens of his relationship with his two children, his twins, and that was different than Rebekah's, because Rebekah loved the younger one, Jacob, and Isaac loves the older one, who is Esav, and he wants to bless the older one, and the younger one steals the blessings, and then he has to run away. And that leads us to next parsha where Jacob runs away to Haran. But all this, so we get very little about him, um, and but we have to try to build the character or build the profile from looking at first of all his relationship with his children and also his relationship with his children and the few events that the Torah does tell us about what he liked to do. So, in other words, his interaction and his career choice, but it's very scarce, and therefore many people just write him off as not interesting. In other words, as someone who was introverted and not really interested in the world around him. But you'll see in a minute from the Hasidic and Kabbalistic perspective that is incorrect. So the first thing we want to do, the format or the roadmap for the next few minutes, even though the roadmap is not set in stone, we'd like to go off in different directions. But if you want to think about the roadmap, we want to think about the difference, or we want to contrast Abraham and Isaac from the Kabbalistic perspective, and then think about how that difference is expressed in the episodes of the Parsha, and particularly in the fact that he tries to bless his older son, who was less than holy and less than perfect and less than wholesome. And if we have time, we could actually, I was thinking about reading one essay, but that essay, I can't find it in the English. So I opened up another essay, of a Hasidic essay from the Rebbe, which also talks about the specifics of the blessings. And again, those specifics of the blessings is going to hopefully reflect Isaac's philosophy and character traits. And again, tie this all back to us. Everything here that we talk about has to be relevant to us because the premise is that if a story is in the Torah, and especially if it's a story about the patriarchs and matriarchs, it is relevant to each of us because when we say someone is the patriarch of the Jewish people, we mean that their spiritual character exists within every soul. So every person has an Abraham, every person has an Isaac, every person has the Jacob, and these are the spiritual tools that help us navigate the world around us, our relationships, and our purpose of creation. So that is introductory point. And now I think we're ready to begin. If anyone has any comments, questions at this point or at any point, please do not hesitate and jump right in. Okay. So what do we know about Abraham and Isaac? And we'll talk about Abraham. We've been talking about Abraham for a few weeks, but to contrast him with Isaac. So according to the Kabbalah, Abraham represents the idea of loving kindness. Loving kindness is just a fancy word of saying he's loving and he's giving. And the Torah talks about this. The prophets refer to Abraham as Abraham Ohavi, Abraham who loves me. So Abraham is motivated by love, and because he's a loving person, he's always giving. And when the problem, some people are always loving, they're also not discerning. So their love is blinding, and they don't necessarily see the negative in other people. They see the good in everybody. And that's a good thing for some, that's a good thing for, sometimes. there's all kinds of stories about people who were like that, who they were incapable of seeing negativity in other people. And Abraham is like that. And that explains some of the stories that we had in the past, which is that, for example, when Abraham marries first before he has a child, before he has Isaac, he marries his maidservant, the maidservant Hagar, and he has a son Yishmael, and Yishmael is a bad influence on Isaac, and Sarah wants him to send away Yishmael, and and he doesn't want to, and it's very difficult for him to do so, and he only does so because God ultimately tells him he has to. And the idea, the profile fits the profile. He's a loving person. He only sees love. He doesn't see the negativity in people. And therefore, he doesn't know how to, I don't know if he doesn't know how to, he doesn't want to. It's the idea of discipline and setting boundaries is the opposite of his character. That is Abraham. And now in the Kabbalah, we talk about the 10 sfirot, 10 divine traits that God expresses for the purpose of creation, and how every human soul also has those 10 traits. And specifically, there are 3 intellectual, 7 emotional. So we'll talk about the 7 emotional traits. The 7 emotional traits really this primary emotions are 3, and really the primary emotions are 2, and the third is just a combination. So Abraham is chesed, loving kindness. That's the one primary emotion. And in simple English, okay, we'll show how the primary in a minute. Then so the Kabbalah puts that on the right side. That's considered the right side. And then you have the left side. And what's the left side? Left side is the opposite. What is the opposite of love? The opposite of love is, again, we're not talking about hate. We're talking about in a positive emotion. The opposite of love would be it could be all different ways of talking about it. But in a sense, what we're going to talk about, it is discipline, or call it awe, or call it respect. And that's the opposite of Abraham, and that is the quality of Isaac. And one way to think about it is that if you want to think about primary emotions, what are the primary emotions that people can feel? And obviously there are many, many, many different types of emotions, and most emotions that we experience are not one emotion, it's a mixture of many emotions. So it's really like the primary colors, and then you go to the store to buy some paint, and they give you a book of 5,000 colors. And I didn't know there are 5,000 colors, but there are. So, but if you break it, but if you go back to the source, essentially there are very few primary colors. So what are the primary emotions? So the Kabbalah says essentially the primary emotions are just the right side and the left side, which is love on one hand, and gevura, which we call strength or discipline or awe, on the left side. And if you really want to be very basic about this and primal about this, emotion means how do I act? How do I react to the world around me? And if you want to generalize, it's basically one of 2 ways. Either I'm drawn to something, and that would be love. Love is the desire to become one. When I love something, I want to become one with it. Therefore, I'm chesed, therefore I'm kind, therefore I'm giving. I want to connect. So I'm flowing outward, flowing outside of myself and flowing to others. That is one side, one primary emotion. And the other primary emotion is the opposite, is when I'm repelled by something. So I come back to self. So if I want something, I'm drawn. And if I don't want it, or I'm afraid of it, or I hate it, or everything else that I'm not flowing outward, not flowing toward the thing, but flowing away from that thing, then the energy is going back. And that would be called in the Kabbalah gevura, strength, discipline, or what they all have in common is it's creating a separation between me and the subject or the object in the outside world, as opposed to love, which is I want to fuse, I want to become one, or is I recognize that I'm separate, that I'm different, or hate is therefore I'm running away from it because it makes me so upset. But those are the 2 primary emotions. And Isaac represents the second, the holding back, the discipline, the discipline, and in a way, awe, and the opposite of love, which is why Abraham spends his career running around and preaching wherever he goes. Vayikra b'shem Hashem, he calls in the name of God, and therefore we know that the tradition tells us that that Abraham ultimately is a very charismatic person, and he influences thousands of people about his newfound teachings, which is monotheism, the existence of one God, and morality. And he's a very famous and prominent person. We know last week when he had to bury his wife, he wants to buy a piece of land, and they don't want to sell it to him. Eventually, they agree to sell it, but they keep telling him, Nasi Elohim, you are a minister of God. Um, we'll give you whatever you want. We don't want to sell, but we'll give you. So, in other words, you see clearly that people had a tremendous amount of respect for him, and they considered him the Prince of God, and he had an influence. He had good PR. When it comes to Isaac, you don't really see, we don't hear him talking, we don't hear him about influencing people. He's sort of living his life in the south of Israel, minding his own business. So, in a way, that reflects the idea that he's not outgoing, he's not flowing outward, he's internal, focusing on self, respecting other people, respecting their position, and not necessarily coming to preach. So, that is, on one level, Abraham and Isaac. Next week, we'll get to Jacob, maybe even this week, but Jacob's supposed to be a blend of the two because the three primary emotions are really two primary emotions, which is the right side and the left side, then there's the center, and the center is supposed to be the blend. And Jacob is the blend, which is compassion, but we could talk about we'll talk about that next week. Now we're still dealing with Isaac. So you have Isaac, and now again, the takeaway is that every person has to cultivate some of Abraham and some of Isaac. Isaac is misunderstood because awe is misunderstood and respect is misunderstood. And in some ways, if we look carefully, I don't know if we want to get into this now, but if we look carefully, you will see that Isaac's impact, forget about his own spiritual state, but his impact on the people around him in a way was far more profound than Abraham's. And that becomes very interesting because you think Abraham is the preacher. Abraham is the charismatic preacher, and Isaac is the introvert, and he's sort of focusing on self. We don't see any, and they don't see any effort to go and spread the faith. And yet you will see in a few significant places, it's very short, but the few stories that the Torah tells us, about him, because they're so few, they're so telling. And you see that in some ways his impact is more profound. So that's thought-provoking, and we have to think about that and say, maybe there's more to think about when you think about the idea of gevura, of strength, of holding back, of discipline. And once we get to that, we can get to the next stage of the story is why then does he prefer the older son, who is more aggressive and more less righteous and less wholesome, if he's supposed to be the one who is into discipline and into borders and into boundaries. So that's the next layer. But before we get to layer 2, we have to start with layer 1. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question about the character, the negative emotions. For example, when you mentioned the discipline, on that spectrum, there is also like you repulsed by something. So my first question is, do any of the patriarchs experience any negative emotions? And then that brings me to the second question about Asaph, because if Jacob is Tiferet, right?
Yeah.
So what is Asaph in a way? Does he have any negative emotions also?
So when you talk about negative emotion, it's a subject for itself, but I'll just be very brief. And the idea is that according to the Kabbalah and based on other traditional sources, is that everything that God creates has a mirror image in the negative. So in other words, what we would call it the animal soul and godly soul. And essentially what we're saying is if there is, just like there's 10 sfirot, there's 10 character traits that reflect the divine character traits. So there's 10 holy character traits. But in order that there should be balance in this world between good and evil, so there can be free choice, the unholy energy also possesses those 10 traits. So just like love, there is positive love and there's negative love. What is positive love? Love to something that is worthy of love. And negative love is loving something that is destructive or negative. And the same thing with awe, to be disciplined and to have or fear. There could be a positive fear and negative fear, right? There could be a fear that I'm saying I'm afraid of something and therefore I am going to try to prepare and protect myself against it. That's positive fear. And then there could be paralyzing fear, right? And then there's also fear of something that's not worthy of fear. And the same thing it could be anger and hate, which essentially is a fear, but it's not expressed itself in a constructive way, right? Anger is I'm not happy with what I'm seeing, but instead of investing, instead of communicating, I just explode. So the short answer is that yes, every one of these traits also have a negative. But the patriarchs is supposed to be the embodiment of the positive traits. Now, it doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it means that they embody the positive traits. Now, I want to talk about Esav and Yishmael. So the Kabbalah talks about this, that Yishmael is kindness, but it's the unholy kindness. And we can talk about why that is. And therefore, in a way, Yishmael, people thought that Yishmael is much more, and Abraham thought Yishmael seems much closer to Abraham than Isaac, because Abraham is kindness and Yishmael is kindness. And Isaac is not kind. He's not flowing. He's not sharing. He's not giving. He's not expansive. He's introverted. So he looks very different than his father. He's that more like his mother. But the Kabbalah says in some way God has to keep telling Isaac that, to keep telling Abraham, no, Isaac is your true heir. Why? Because even though that Yishmael looks like he's closer to Isaac, because both are kindness, but that's on the surface. If you get to the motivation of the kindness, here they depart. Abraham's kindness is based on humility. I see that somebody else doesn't have what I have, so I share with him because I'm humble and I realize the other person is more deserving than I, so I share. That's that's the holy motivation of kindness based on humility. Whereas Yishmael is the opposite. Yishmael says, I am so blessed, and when I give you, I feel that you're dependent on me, and that makes me feel even better about myself. So we're both writing the check. But the question is, what is the motivation? And on the motivation level, one is kindness based on humility, and one is kindness based on arrogance. Now, there's another question of should you perform kindness even if it makes you arrogant? The short answer is yes. But what I'm trying to say here is that every single trait also has the mirror of that trait in the negative.
So
So
what is the mirror of compassion then? And also what I hear you say.
compassion is empathy to the wrong places. You see this every day. And
Uh-huh.
just like you can have a love for the wrong place, empathy for the wrong in the wrong way. The Gemara says, if you have empathy on the cruel, you will end up having cruelty to the people deserving of empathy. Misplaced empathy. I have empathy to the aggressor. So what happens? Then the victim doesn't get empathy. So
Right.
now I'm cruel to the victim, right? So everything could be misplaced.
Beautiful. So what I'm hearing you say is it's the attribute, the feeling, but it's more about the goal, the expression, motivation.
Yeah, because emotion in general, when I say love, that's the problem with saying that problem with these words. These words are not perfect because one word cannot express the intensity of this emotion, especially that it's a primary emotion. So I say kindness, and kindness could be I'm giving, but we're not really talking about the act of giving. We're talking about the feeling. And the feeling is really attraction. I feel connected to you. Attraction, connection. Again, there's not one word in the dictionary that can capture a primary emotion. Even the word love can mean so many different things. But we're talking about love, connection, attraction. These are emotional states. These are how I feel emotionally to somebody or something outside of myself. The action, whether or not I buy the person a cup of coffee, is already secondary. It's external, right? But when we say emotion, we mean the emotion that is expressed with this action.
Right.
So so
Where does it place Asaph then?
So according to the Kabbalah, Esav is Gevura. Esav is the unholy Gevura. But because Esav is a son of Isaac, he's not necessarily fully unholy. In other words, there are parts of Esav that are elevated. And that was the other essay that I was going to say. I was going to say, because we know there's a medrash that talks about that how Esav was killed, how Esav died. I don't want to get into that. It's a long story, but the short answer is that Esav's head, I hate to be so gory on Friday morning, Esav's head is buried at the feet of Isaac in the cave of Machpelah, which means part of Esav is next to Isaac, right? So Esav is different than Yishmael. Yishmael is not considered Jewish because his mother wasn't Sarah, right? So he has a different mother. Isaac, Esav, even though Esav is considered unholy, and especially we talked about this on Tuesday in the rabbinic tradition, much of Western culture, which is really Roman culture, which was very brutal, certainly at that time when the Romans were at odds with were at odds with Judaism and they were oppressing Judaism. The rabbis saw the Roman Empire, who was then oppressing the Jews, as embodiment of Esav. So Esav certainly has negativity. However, Esav is not beyond redemption because Esav is the son of Isaac and Rebekah. So we say Esav, parts of Esav actually could and should be elevated and be brought back to Yitzchak. And that's the sort of I don't know if it's literal or it's a medrash, so it doesn't have to be literal, but the idea that Esav's head is next to Isaac. In other words, Esav in his elevated state is holy. But then the problem is when you sever the head and the body, then the body also can become more destructive. So we could talk about that. That ties in also into Abraham versus Isaac, giving versus elevating. So we got a lot to do.
Right.
We got a
And
lot.
also maybe like why Isaac liked Esau.
Yeah, that's going to tie in. That's going to tie in. That's going to tie in. Okay. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Again, I'm not making any guarantees that we're covering everything, so I don't want to false advertising. But the guarantee is that we wet the tongue. That's the promise, and it's just an invitation to continue studying. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Good morning. Could you just briefly comment? I mean, the quintessential image of Isaac is a well digger. Could you
Oh,
just tie in the well
yes,
digging
yes,
with the
yes, yes,
strength
yes.
and all that?
Yes, let's talk about well digging. That's the next step. Thank you. I can end up anywhere. So thank you for keeping me on the straight and narrow. Isaac, we know he dug wells. Now, obviously Isaac dug wells. He lived in the south of Israel. He needed water. But if the Torah is telling you he dug wells, that means that this is important to understand the character of Isaac. Now, not only does it say he dug wells, but the Torah gets into specifics. He dug one well, and then there was a conflict with the local people, the local tribes of the Philistines, of the people of Gerar, and then he went and dug another one, and then there was also conflict. And it's so interesting to know that how that he dug wells. We also know the name that he gave to the first well and the name that he gave to the second well. And ultimately, he dug a third well, and he called it Rechovot, which could mean broad expansiveness. And nobody challenged him on the third well, and he lived happily ever after. And it's a short passage; it's maybe 5, 10 verses. But if you think about of everything we know about Isaac, if you want to talk about his own career, is so little that this must be telling. So Isaac digs wells. So how does the Kabbalah view the story of Isaac digging wells? So what the Kabbalah says is like this. There are two ways. So there's a practical thing. He lived in the south of Israel. If you want to live in the south of Israel, you have to dig wells. But it's not the only thing you can do, because what you could do is you could actually come and you could pump water in from the north. Now, I'm not saying you should do that. I don't know if they had the technology, but in the beginning of the state of Israel, in the early 1950s, there was the government company called Hamovil Haaretzi, and they built piping, and they brought water from the north to the south, because if you're living in the south, you must have water. So maybe they couldn't pump it in, so Isaac had to dig wells. But if you want to talk about it on a metaphorical level, what this really means, so the Kabbalah says as follows: Abraham is somebody who's going to come and bring you water. If there's no water here, he's going to come and pump in water. In other words, chesed, loving kindness, its quality, but it's also drawback, is that I am going to enlighten you. I am going to bring you the water. If it's a parched land, I'll bring in water. What does Isaac say? Isaac is disciplined. Isaac says, I don't have to bring you the water. Because not because I don't want to, because I don't think that's going to be so helpful. What I can do, what kavura does, what strength does, what discipline does, what respect does, it says, I believe that you have the water. You have the answer within yourself. And my job at the most is to dig the well. Dig the well means I'm not bringing the water here. I'm just helping you, or helping the earth remove the obstacle to find and remove the earth, the covering, and find the water that's already within that space, that's innate in that space. So Isaac is cultivating instead of preaching. That's a very big difference, right? Your kid comes home and your kid says, "Could you help me with the homework?" I said, "No, I have to ask AI. I don't know. I don't know fifth grade math." No, I'm kidding. I say, "Yeah, I'm going to help you with it. I'll give you the answer." That's the that's kindness. I don't want to say it's kind, because kind is already a subjective term, but that's giving. I'll give you the answer. Sure, I'll give you the answer. And for parents, many times giving is easier than withholding. Because what Isaac would say is, I'm not giving you the answer. Not because I hate you, not because I don't like you, because there's no point. Because I believe that you have the capacity to find it yourself. So I can help you. I can give you a hint. I can help you with the tools. I can tell you where to look. I'm removing the earth. But I'm removing your earth, and then the water is present. I help you discover that the water is present within yourself. So also, if you want to talk about discipline, a respect, because respect is also barrier. Respect. Love is I'm one with you. And the problem with being one with you is that if I'm one with you, then if I like this, then you like this. So in some sense, love could be suffocating. I like sushi, so you have to eat sushi. I like this vacation, so you have to like this vacation. And if not, I feel like, oh, there's a problem with the love. What is respect? Respect represents the fact that I'm holding myself back. I realize that there's a place where I end and someone else begins. And then I say, I respect your perspective and I respect your ability. And maybe you'll do something a little bit different. Maybe your way of figuring out the answer is different than my way, but I respect your ability to find the water where you are. So in that sense, the digging of the water, it was a practical concern. Isaac, I'm sure, needed to dig water because he was living in a place without any rain. But if the Torah is telling us he dug wells, because he did a lot of things that Torah doesn't tell us about. I'm sure he ate breakfast and I'm sure he read the newspaper, but the Torah doesn't tell us about it because that's not part of the story. It's not part of the lesson. It's not part of the spiritual, it's not part of his spiritual profile. But digging wells is clearly part of his spiritual profile. So now, so it turns out in the final analysis that Isaac is also influencing people. But his influence is not in a way that he's preaching or giving or sharing or teaching or taking out ads in the newspaper, but it's much more quiet, much more subtle. But in a way, it's much more effective. But now here's the problem. Everything obviously has a cost. So Abraham has a far broader circle of influence because he could preach to many more people. He had thousands of people he could preach to. Um, Isaac's influence, how many people, when you have to take the long route, when you have to dig wells, it's much, he had 3 wells. In other words, it takes much more labor intensive and you have to have a lot more patience and it takes a lot more time and your success rate is lower. But, and here's the key, when a person is effective with influencing someone in the path of Isaac, then the effect is internalized and the transformation is lasting. And that's another point. So the point here is when you have a charismatic preacher like Abraham, so Abraham in his lifetime was very successful. He influenced a lot of people. But as Maimonides says, the thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people that Abraham preached to and were his followers in his lifetime, we have no idea where they went after he died. In other words, they drifted away. Why did they drift away? Because they were in the light of Abraham, and Abraham had the charisma, and Abraham had the influence. But when Abraham ceases to influence, then they drift away. Isaac, if someone's giving someone the tools to dig their own well in a way to find their own water, then maybe he's influencing fewer people, but that influence is enduring. And that is part of the story of the digging of the wells. And that's why I alluded to this before. But the Torah tells us also about wells. The Torah tells us that Abraham also dug wells because he also lived in Beersheba. He lived in different places throughout the years. He lived in Hebron for many years, but then he went to Beersheba, he went to the south, and he also dug wells. But the Torah says something about something very interesting about the wells that Abraham died, and that is Abraham dug, and that is that after Abraham died, the Philistines filled up the wells. They stuffed up the wells. They didn't want the water for themselves, but they didn't want Abraham. I guess they didn't want Abraham and Isaac. They didn't want this foreigner settling here. So if you have to get rid of somebody, you just get rid of their sources of water, and then they're going to have to migrate. So all the wells that Abraham digs in his lifetime he was respected. So nobody challenged Abraham in his lifetime, at least not directly. They did a little bit of pichol in this the story of Rosh Hashanah, but as soon as Abraham confronts him, they make peace. They call it Beersheba. Nobody confronts him directly in his lifetime, but after he dies, they cover up the wells. They stuff it up. Isaac, they're confronting him in his lifetime, but ultimately they make peace, and ultimately they let him stay, and ultimately they honor him, and they don't stuff up the wells. What is that telling us? It tells us that Abraham, yes, he's more charismatic. So his influence is much greater and it's much more profound, and he influences many more people, but it's not enduring. Because ultimately, when you give somebody something, you're giving it to them. That's what we'd call top down. That does not change the person. When you help a person grow, what the Kabbalah would call milamata lamayla, from below to above, then you tell them, I respect you. I'm not giving it to you. I respect you. I respect your ability to grow by yourself, or I can direct you, but you have to do the work. Then that influence and that effort is enduring. So that is a little bit about the digging of the wells, and that's the second story. And then if anyone has any questions or comments, we'd love to hear. And then we can move to the next story, which is where the drama is about, which is the Isaac's relationship with Esav, which is in some ways very counterintuitive, and where Jacob comes in and Rebecca comes in, and then we can talk about the differences of opinions in Jacob and Isaac and Rebecca. And it just goes on and on and on. Now, whatever we don't finish this week, we can finish in 2 weeks, because in 2 weeks from now we have the reunion of Isaac and we're going to have to readdress this whole idea of Jacob and Esau, so we can talk about that. But we'll start the journey today. Okay, so what happens now? Now we have the next story. What's the next story? The big drama in the parsha. The big drama is that Isaac has twins, and when they're young, nobody sees the difference really between the two, which some people say is a big problem. Right? The problem is that nobody noticed. It says once they grew up, they saw one guy is a hunter and one guy sits in the tents. So in other words, nobody noticed that they're any different. So this sort of one size fits all education, which is not a good idea. So that's a critique in a way. But they grow up, and one person is a man of hunting, and we talked about this a little bit on Tuesday. I don't want to get too carried away with this, but at least the way the traditional view is, Esav is not just hunting, which is a neutral activity, but that's just an expression of his aggression. So Esav is aggressive, and Esav is we have nothing positive to say about him other than he honored his father, but his character traits are very aggressive and not spiritual. Put it to you that way. And Jacob, whereas Jacob is a man of Ishtam, wholesome person sitting in the tent. So he's a man of ideas. He's thinking. And surprisingly, Isaac gets old and he wants to bless his children, but he wants to bless his older child. And even before he wants to bless him, the Torah says, "Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav." Jacob, Isaac loves Esav. He loves his older son because he was game in his mouth. That's another story. And Rebecca loves Jacob. Now, and then the story continues where Jacob steals the blessings, but that's already another story. Let's stop right here. It's surprising that the Jacob, who in many ways, Isaac, who in many ways is the most spiritual of the patriarchs. He's the most introverted. He's the most spiritual. What I mean is spiritual. You see this in different places where, for example, there was a famine in this parsha. There's a famine in the land, and Isaac wants to do what you usually go to do. What do you do when there's a famine in the land of Israel? What do you do? We know this happens again and again in the book of Exodus. It happened and Genesis. It happened already before, and it's going to happen again. When there's a famine, you go to Egypt to buy bread. Why Egypt? Because Egypt now doesn't have any famines. Because Egypt has a Nile. It only happens once when that story with Pharaoh's dreams. But that's very unusual. That's why no one could think of the answer. No one can predict that there'll be a famine in Egypt, because there are no famines in Egypt. Egypt has the Nile. And the Nile starts, even though Egypt is desert, but the Nile starts in Central Africa, where it's very, very rainy. So Abraham, when there was a famine, Abraham goes down to Egypt. There's no problem. When there's a famine, when Jacob has trouble, he runs away from Israel, goes back to Haran, goes back to Turkey. When later there's a famine, his sons go down to Egypt. Everybody is happy to move around. When it comes to Isaac, there's a famine, and Isaac wants to go to Egypt. And God says, do not go to Egypt. You have to stay here. Shchain ba'aretz, you live in the land, and therefore he doesn't go to Egypt. He goes to the border of Israel. He goes to Gerar, which is where the Philistines lived. But the point here, the matter is, Rashi makes the point, quotes the Medrash, you cannot leave Israel. Why? Because you're holy. You're holier than patriarchs and matriarchs? Yes, you're an offering. You're offered to God at the binding of Isaac. Right? The binding of Isaac in halacha and Jewish law, once you consecrate an animal and you say, this is for the temple, oh, you're not allowed to use it. It's a great sin to use it. So Isaac, yes, he wasn't slaughtered, but he was dedicated to God. So he's holy. He can't be taken out of Israel. So Isaac, in some ways, is the most sheltered, most protected. He can never leave. He can never leave the holy environment of Israel. And yet, when it comes to his own relationship, you would expect him to be attracted to Jacob. Instead, he's attracted to Esau, which is unusual. So if you want to talk about this on a basic level, you say, opposites attract. Sometimes you see somebody who's so different than you, and that's what's exotic, and that's what you like. Okay, I have no problem with that interpretation, but certainly there's more to it. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, it goes something like this: if Isaac is a well digger, if Isaac has respect, again, the problem with love. I don't want to bash love here because you need love too. You need it. If we were talking about last week, we talk about love, but you came the wrong week. So we're talking about the respect. So you want to bash love a little bit. The problem with love is that in love, I want to become one with you. I'm the giver. I'm the preacher. I have the answers. I'm going to influence you. In a way, love is a lack of respect. And respect is, I could see that we're different, but I respect your perspective and I see the good in your perspective. So counterintuitively, if Isaac is a well digger, and part of the quality of a well digger is he comes to parched land and he says that even though it doesn't seem this way, I believe that deep down, if I dig hard enough, if I work strong enough, I can help you discover that there's water here, but native water here. Not that I'm going to bring in water from elsewhere. So in other words, I can help you discover that I don't have to preach to you about God, but the ideas of godliness and the ideas of spirituality and the ideas of morality are innate within you and they're going to resonate within you. Not because I am saying it, but because you believe that. So that's different. That's respect. So if Isaac can come to a land and say, I could see water here, then the same thing is with a person. When Isaac sees a person and he sees that the person is in a state of chaos and negativity and he cannot sit straight, but he's also destructive. Isaac sees that and respects that. And I see you're different. I see you have different energy than I, or like my kids call it, you have a different vibe than I. But I respect you, and I could see your spiritual source, and I could believe, have faith that there are living waters here. And if we could work this out together, if we could have a relationship, we could maybe perhaps communicate and get to the point where you will discover the water within yourself. And then you get to a whole different story, which the Kabbalah talks about, is that the negative and the worlds of chaos have a greater power and energy because they have a greater source than the world of order. In other words, the person with the seemingly negative traits, and they do have negative traits, but if those traits then could be channeled to holiness, then the result is far more powerful than the holiness itself. So to talk about this in other terms, you have what we would call the animal soul and the godly soul. So you have the spiritual side of self and the materialistic side of self. And in the usual hierarchy, the spiritual side of self is higher than the material side of self, or the physical side of self, or the selfish part of self. That's the conventional hierarchy, where holiness is higher than unholiness, where holiness is higher, the transcendence is higher than the selfish and the self-oriented. That's the conventional model. But the Kabbalah always says that something that the beginning is rooted in the end. So something that is very low in this world, it's because it has a very high source. And now the question is, if you can get the self-oriented side of self to want to love holiness and want to love God, then the passion that it will produce is far greater than the passion of the godly soul. The godly soul, Jacob is a man of the tent. He likes spiritual ideas, but he doesn't have that passion and that aggression to be able to cleave to God with that same strength and that same passion of the way Asa wants to hunt. Or in my own life, I have spiritual desires, I have materialistic desires. I want to study the whole Talmud and I want to eat chocolate cake. Unfortunately, when I want to eat chocolate cake, that happens much quicker than when I want to study the whole Talmud. Why? Because the animal soul is an animal and the human soul is human. And who's stronger, the human or the animal? The animal is stronger. The animal is more aggressive. Now, ultimately, the peace becomes when the human is able to channel the animal, and then you can start planting produce. Then you can start creating civilization. You can start creating agriculture. And that's what King Solomon says. More grain is in the power of the ox. The ox has more grain. Who can produce more grain, the ox or the human? Of course, the ox. But that's if the ox is producing grain and not just running around being destructive. So the human is supposed to therefore channel the ox channels destructive energy to productive energy. So Isaac sees Esav, and instead of writing him off, because he has this element of respect, which is I don't have to preach to you to be like me. I respect our differences. I respect that you see the world different than I. Maybe I'm coming from a place of transcendence and holiness and humility, and you're coming from a place that is self-oriented and asking yourself and even egotistical and saying, what is in it for me? But I respect that even if you follow that path and you really get to the point, you can start loving God because it's more pleasurable for your own ego. In other words, you could realize that this actually feels better to help other people to go hunt. He says, go hunt and bring me game so I can bless you. You can actually get to the point where hunting to feed your father is actually more enjoyable than hunting just for the sake of aggression, right? So, but Isaac senses this. It's a little counterintuitive, but if you think about it, it makes sense. Isaac senses the positive source and the positive potential within his son because he has respect and because he's not loving kindness, which means I'm one with you, which means in a way you're like me or you're an extension of me, but I respect your differences. Now the question is, why was he right or wrong, and why he probably was wrong in the final analysis? I'm not saying because he was wrong. The reason why I'm saying he's wrong because he himself, when he realizes that Jacob stole the blessings, he himself therefore blesses Jacob and ultimately agrees with Jacob's path. But that stays the same. Isaac is the one who discovers that Esau has water. The question then becomes, how do you get to that water? Do you channel Esau directly, or do you channel Jacob to influence Esau? But that's already the next layer of the conversation. What you see here so far is that Esau is right. I mean, Isaac is right. And Isaac is spot on that Esau's potential is greater than Jacob's because Esau's source is greater than Jacob. And the physical and the spiritual and the spiritual and the spiritual and the material, the source of the material is higher than the source of the spiritual, which is radical and flips everything on its head. But that's what the Kabbalah does. So these are big ideas. We have to unpack them. But in the meantime, go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I think that's the direction you're going because it's kind of hard to believe that Isaac didn't have any feelings for Jacob because it's a new kind of blend, right? Givur and the Tiferet, it's kindness, and it's hard to believe that Jacob didn't realize it, right? And at the end, he does bless. He doesn't object that it
Right.
was Jacob who he blessed.
Right. Yeah, when you say he doesn't like him, when you say he loved him, you have that next parsha, Jacob loves Leah. It doesn't mean he hates the other one. When you say he loves one of the sons, it means his extraordinary connection to an extraordinary bond. But it's very hard for parents to connect to some, not very, it's generalization. Sometimes it's very hard for parents to connect to a child that is different than them. In other words, if it's an emotional situation and the child reacts different than they would react, it's very hard to connect. And I know this because me and my wife are very different, and our children, some are much more like me, some much more like her. And in my family also, my mother and father are very different. And when you have moments of crisis and one person just likes to be expressive and the other person wants time for themselves, and if the other person, even if you love the person, but if that person's character are different than yours, and especially in moments of crisis, especially when it matters, it's very hard to connect. It's very hard to see. It's very hard to connect when the other person is reacting very different than the way you would. And then you have to have a certain maturity to realize that that's okay. Everybody does things in their own way. But naturally, the natural instinct is to Isaac is different than his father. He can't connect to his father. We talked about this. He only connects to his father at the Akedah. He can't connect to his father, and therefore he can't connect to Jacob. Doesn't mean he doesn't love him, but it means they're not communicating in the same wavelength. They don't see the world the same way. Even though Isaac is more, even though Jacob is a blend, but it seems like within the blend, the right side is dominant because that's the way it was within compassion as well. The right side is dominant. So he's more like Abraham than like Isaac. So when you say he loves it, this means he doesn't hate it. This means he doesn't like him. He just says, like, I don't respond to crises or to difficult opportunities or difficult situations in the same way that you do. So I can't connect. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but in my life, I could see this. I could see like in the moment of a challenging moment, a difficult moment, or an important moment, when the other person just doesn't respond the way you would, it's very hard to connect, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Also, the fact that Esau was kind of deceiving him in as far as
so every trait has a positive and a negative, right?
Yeah, his respect to his father resulted in deceiving him and to think that he's
yeah. But that's that. Yeah, That itself.
Oh, how dynamic develop, and by the time he was giving blessings, the children were already grown, so he could have
Right.
realized potential if it's not realized by age. I don't know how age it was, like 20, 30. It's harder to with age, right? But
Right.
still saw that potential, and
And
he's
they were at that point when they got the blessings, I think they were in the almost 60, 63, because he was, yeah. But let's think about this for a second. Kid, I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to name names because I don't want to out my own family, but let's say a kid comes home and makes trouble, does something clever, got himself into trouble. So I could conceive, without naming any names, I can conceive a situation where one parent is very upset, and the other parent is like, "Oh, very good, you're very smart, you did something clever, you figured out how to maneuver the world. It's going to come and help you in the future, right?" And I could see where two people are going to react very differently, and one connects to this child and sees this child as she sees like, "Oh wow, this is creativity, and this is this is take risk taking and seeing all those good traits, even though the expression risk taking, but it's a negative, but you express it in a negative way. But I could see one parent actually being amused and being happy, regardless of what they tell the kid, if they're going to take away the allowance or not, the punishment or the consequence. It's a separate question. I'm talking about emotionally. It's like your kid come home, got into trouble. One parent is very proud, very good, I'm very happy, and the other parent is like upset, right? So it's more of the natural response, and then you have to overcome the natural response. But the natural response is Isaac understands, Isaac respects Esav and sees the good in it, not the good in the current form, but he sees the good in the state of potential. Now, of course, you have to now channel that potential. That's already a separate discussion, but he's right about seeing the potential and the elevated state, the elevated source of Esav.
beautiful. Thank you. And also maybe he saw the positive in tricking in Jacob tricking him, because it's his expression of strength of
Yeah,
different.
yeah. When a kid outsmarts the parent, one parent is upset and one parent is amused.
That's why he got another book.
Yeah, that's the Gemara has a story about that. I don't want to get into this, that there's a debate between the rabbis, and the majority of rabbis have one opinion, and an individual has a different opinion, and then a divine voice comes from heaven. It's a whole long story, but the divine voice comes from heaven and says the individual is right. And the rabbi said, we don't care. It says in the Torah, Lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven, Torah is on earth. We don't care about the voice from heaven. So basically, God is trying to intervene, and the rabbis are saying, we don't care what God says. You would think God would be offended. So the continuation of the story in the Talmud is that one of the sages sees Elijah, and he says, what did God do at that moment when God issues forth this voice from the heaven, and the rabbis reject the voice from heaven? So Elijah says God smiled and he said, "Nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni, my children won me. They won me." In other words, God was amused. Very good, right? So when your kid could answer back, you can get offended, or you could say, "Wow, this kid finally, this kid is expressing his creativity." Now, maybe this is not the way to do it. Okay, fine. That's a separate discussion. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
So much of what you say is so counterintuitive. I mean, I think if you went to your Gimel class now across the hall and you sort of said, who comes off as the most strong patriarch, they would not come up with Isaac.
Right.
If you came up with the idea that who deserves the most or least square footage, biblical square footage,
Right.
you might say somebody who's strong deserves, a good deal of biblical,
Right. Real estate.
real estate, but he gets none.
Yeah.
In many people's minds, there are the good guys and the bad guys. And the bad guys, you have Ishmael, Esau, Amalek, Haman, Hitler, whatever. Nobody kind of spends any moments thinking of the potential good side of any of these people.
Right.
So, what are the Kabbalists doing here? I mean, are they just basically saying that there's two sides to every coin?
No. They're not looking for moral relativism. What the Kabbalists are starting from a point of unity. Hashem Echad, God is one. Everything emerges from Hashem. Everything emerges from holiness. And one of the big Kabbalistic problems that the Kabbalah is very interested in, so where does the unholiness come from? Right? So going back to the pagan faiths, and even the monotheistic faiths some of them believe this idea, that the negativity comes from Satan. So you have a source of holiness, that's God. And then you have a source of negativity, and that's Satan. And anything negative in the world comes from Satan. And then just write it off. Just put everything, it's very easy, us against them. But the Kabbalah says Judaism cannot accept that. It's not just the Kabbalah, normative Judaism also, the traditional Judaism. The Mishnah says something bad happens, you have to thank God, just like when something good happens. So we don't have the luxury to say that negativity is just separate from holiness. Ultimately, we all start from holiness. Now, that's our origin point. And then you want to talk about where is the world heading? So the world is heading, at least according to Judaism, to peace and serenity. Right? So our origin point is all starts from Hashem, and the end point is all positive. So what do we do with all this negativity in this world? And wherever you look, you see negativity. So you can look at it. So ultimately, what the Kabbalah is saying is that, of course, there's absolute evil that has to be destroyed. So we're not saying that Hitler could be rectified. There is negativity that could self-destruct. But there's also negativity that has to be brought back into the sphere of holiness and has to be channeled. And not only to save it, but to save us. In other words, Jacob has to ultimately, the Messianic era cannot come until Jacob influences Esav, until Judea influences Rome, until morality of the Jewish people influences the might of the science and technology of Western culture, which is Esav, right? So in other words, we're not saying, the point is not, the game is not to say, but in some ways the Kabbalah is that game, that what seems higher is really lower, but that's also in the Gemara. That's also in the Gemara. That's another whole story. So it's not just we're trying to game and prove that we can see positive where other people don't see it. No, these are very important theological principles that are at play here. And also historic principles. What is the purpose of this world? Where are we headed? What do we do with all the negativity? And how do we understand the negativity? And how do we approach it? So yes, there's negativity that has to be channeled and destroyed. The Gemara says in some cases, the only way to fix something is to break it. Right? Sometimes something is so corrupted that you have to fix it. You have to correct it. The Hebrew word tikkun. Tikkun is to fix, to correct. Sometimes the only way to correct it is to break it. But for many other things, the way to connect it is to connect it back to its origin and realize that its strength and its passion and its brute ego does not have to be destructive, and it could be channeled for holiness. And when it does, it may have a more powerful effect than the holy person. Just like the animal, the horsepower of the animal is stronger than the horsepower of the person. So these are, it's not, we're not just being clever here to write a story and say, oh, Esav is also good. When the Kabbalists talk about this and when Judaism talks about this comes from a place of theology, but it also has real practical ramifications.
But yet it's kept to one portion.
It's kept to one portion because Gevura is about holding back. It's about restraint. Respect is about restraint. You have to discover this portion on your own. I can't preach to you that you have to become I can't preach to you that you have to stop preaching, right? It's listening and talking. So Isaac is the listener. Yeah, I ask you, who's more important, who's more influential, the talker or the listener? So I say, in some ways, now we understand, in some ways, the listener is more important. So why doesn't the listener talk more? Because the listener is the listener. So we have to learn to listen to the listener. Right, so that's the point. There is I'm not bashing Abraham and Jacob. God forbid. There is a place for expansiveness, and there is a place of kindness and oneness. All true, but there's also a space for restraint and listening. And when the Torah the argument would be, one way to finish this off is when the Torah speaks very little, it means you have to listen more. Not that it's less interesting, but you have to do more listening, and you have to study. You don't have to, but every word of Torah is holy. But I'm just saying, just for entertainment's sake, what I'm going to try to, just for poetic license, I'm going to say the less time the Torah spends on Isaac means you have to listen more carefully to those verses.
In a way, it's a prompt for your own reflection,
your own listening, your own gevura, your own restraint.
Right. Yes. And yet it goes from Isaac to Yaakov, where we get unbelievable patent place details.
Because he's going to have the advantages of Abraham and Isaac. And you see this in many areas, especially in his children, even though you can say his children weren't perfect, but yet all his children remained within the fold. So if you want to talk about influencing other people, in some ways, Jacob, you have to have both the expressiveness and the respect. Someone says, I respect my children, so I let them do whatever they want. So I never tell them anything. Okay, so you'll have a Yaakov and an Esav. Some people will take some kids that works for some kids, but doesn't work for other kids. And if you say, I'm just going to share and give and not listen to them, you're going to have a Yishmael and an Isaac. It works for some kids, doesn't work for others. So if you want to get through to all your children, which is really all of humanity, you're going to have some blend of the two. Now, it doesn't mean your kids are going to be perfect, just like Jacob's sons were imperfect, but they were all influenced. And that's why, even though it seemed like Judah separating and going away, they all came back. Ultimately, at his deathbed, he has all of his children there. Okay, a lot more to say, but we hit this 11:02. The sun is setting soon in a few hours. So everyone should have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful Shabbos. And today's Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Kislev, which is the month of Hanukkah, which is the month of light and the month of warmth and the month of miracles. So it should be only happiness and only good things for us and all the people of Israel and all of humanity.
Chazak u'baruch.
Baruch, thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom, Shabbat shalom, Karina. Shabbat shalom.